Since we are resuming our study of the life divine after a reasonable gap, it's worth reviewing where we are. We decided to study the last 6 chapters, where Sri Aurobindo moves to the full focus on the applied practice of the integral yoga, and in particular, the stages through all the way to the supramental evolution and transformation. But we began a half chapter before these 6, where Sri Aurobindo describes not only the rationale of rebirth, but also how it is possible to develop our individuality such that we can carry over the continuity of consciousness into the next life. He describes the 3 conditions which are required to be able to do that. And as we said, it is something essential for anybody who has an intention to practice a yoga of transformation. Otherwise, one human lifetime is too small to be able to do what is required, and to have to rebuild all over again in a new personality all the things necessary to even begin the proper journey is a huge waste of time. And it's an aspect of the work which we have to concentrate upon. And so that part of the study was necessary. Subsequently, Sri Aurobindo took up the whole theme of evolution itself, describing the key principles by which evolution takes place and the emergence of the human consciousness and the mind. These principles were necessary to fully understand, because not only he answers all the criticisms placed against the possibility of evolution, but he distinguishes between the evolution of the form in nature and the evolution of the soul. And although the two parallel each other, each supporting the other, still we have to understand how they are different. And then he comes into the proper evolution, which is our immediate focus from the human mind through to the spiritual possibilities. And so this chapter, which we are now studying, is titled The Evolution of the Spiritual Man. Having placed here the larger picture of what this evolutionary turn is leading to, the emergence of the conscious spiritual being, Sri Aurobindo places 2 questions before us, which will be the theme of the discussion in this chapter. First, he says, what is the exact nature of the transition from mental to spiritual being? It's very easy to confuse the spiritual experience with the mental experience, at least at the initial stages, when spirit is not yet decisively come into its own, and there is a half-mixed experience. But what makes the spiritual spiritual and the mental mental? And this distinction and the form of the spiritual being in contrast to the mental being is the first question. But then out of that comes the second question, which is, what is the process and method of the evolution of the spiritual out of the mental man? And so that will be then the larger, broader discussion, not only through this chapter, but in further ones. For which the first step he has taken is to distinguish the mental from the spiritual. He points out that normally in evolution, you will find always the new turn emerges within the old. So life has emerged in matter, so a living plant is still largely physical reality in which life is operating. Similarly, mind has emerged, let's say, in the animal man, in the human being, and we have a mind operating inside what is largely an animal living vehicle. And so the logical conclusion might be that spirituality will emerge inside mind. And so it will be a special kind or turn of mind. So just as we have an artistic mind or a scientific mind, there must be a spiritual mind, which will be a kind of a special interest and special orientation of the mind. And this would be logical, reasonable to consider. Except then he goes deeper into the whole process. And every time he goes deeper, he's opening one of the key secrets of nature and the working of spirit and nature. And here the secret he shows is that every time something emerges out of the old, it can emerge because it was already latent inside. If it was not latent, it could not emerge. And he gives a very simple example that every time you see lightning in the clouds, will you say that the electricity of the lightning is created by the operation of water molecules and the wind? And no, obviously not. Maybe that was the original thought of someone watching out of ignorance. But once you enter the operation of what's happening in the clouds and the lightning, you discover electricity was already inside the water. Or rather, water was made out of the electricity of the electrons. And so by a particular process of the water operation, the electricity was released. But it could be released because it was already there, it was already embedded. In fact, water is a special form of operation of electricity. That's how he reverses the whole game. And once we understand this, he says, what emerges in activity has to be already latent, otherwise it could not have emerged. And so, that which has created mind, which has created life, which has created matter, when it emerges out of mind, life and matter, it can emerge because it was hidden inside. And it created it, and therefore it was hidden inside. And so the whole rationale of evolution now is placed before us, that in the involution, when spirit became as if mind, life, matter, the last term is what comes up first in evolution. And the first term is what comes out last, because evolution is going the other way. And so out of mind, the spirit emerging is the last term. And again, this logic is important because we could say, what about after spirit something else? How do we know there is not something else? In the very definition of spirit, it is the oneness out of which the multiplicity emerges. And so the emergence of spirit is the last step in evolution. Spirit is a final evolutionary emergence because it is the original involutionary element and factor. And this will be critical for us to understand the nature of the spiritual emergence out of mind. But now we recognize that the emerging spirit will not be simply a function of mind. It will be a power distinct from mind, and which will have greater power over mind than mind has power over it. But the problem right now, he says, is we are unable to separate the two. In the first emergence of the spirit, they are so mixed that we can't make out the difference. And what in my mind is the spiritual element? And that's where we attach ourselves to some partial function and say, this is the spirit, or this is my soul. And he describes how in this emergence, there has to be first some decisive step that you can say, this is distinct, it's not my normal consciousness. And this often takes place in the sense of a witness poise of Purusha. But he maps out the various forms in which this can come. There can be a mental poise, some part of the mind that stands back and says, I am not thought. Equally, there can be a vital Purusha, something that stands back from the emotions and life force and feels free and says, I am not this. Or equally, in the physical body, there can be a similar subtle self supporting the body. And this is often experienced by people as so radical that they say, I have found my soul. And that's, of course, the first big error. But still, he says, this is the first radical step where you have something that is not the normal nature. But you have to go further, and then you discover there is a deeper spirit or self, which is as if reflected in these three poises. But itself is not mind, not life, not matter. And it's only when you come to something like that, which is not mind, life, matter, that you can say you have come to a true emergence of the spiritual or the soul. The soul as the personal center looking upon nature, at first may remain detached. It may reflect its intentions or suggestions in the habitual bundle of the personality which is still working, but it can also increasingly put a control and even engage with all of nature, give them a different turn. And he describes how, in the stillness and silence in which we begin to live in that consciousness, one begins to become conscious also of a spiritual substance and spiritual being, which is far greater, more free, which not only opens out to universality, but also to a transcendence above, beyond space and time. And that is the true sense of the spiritual being and the self. And these are the steps through which normally the spiritual evolution emerges out of nature. So in mapping this process of how we awaken to our own spirituality and the stages, Sri Aurobindo has already given you a roadmap of how it is to be done. Often people complain that Sri Aurobindo is not giving enough methods and techniques. But this is an error. It's a wrong understanding. In this very description he has mapped out what needs to be done and how you can get to that eventual spiritual poise. But then he will also go deeper into finer distinctions, issues in these emergences and so on, which will further make complete the process. But broadly now we have a map, and he says it is only through these decisive movements that the true character of the evolution becomes evident. Before that, we have only preparatory movements, and he describes many, how the true soul within us, the psychic being, begins to put a pressure on the mind, life, and body to turn them in some deeper or higher direction. Or there is a pressure from the spirit or the self for liberation from the ego, from surface ignorance, turning the personality to a deeper or higher sense of purpose or truth. And all of these are preparatory tendencies from the influence of the spiritual parts within us on the surface, where we are not aware of them, but they are aware of us. And again, he describes there several finer gradations through which this turn takes place. And it's only when we begin to have the experience of a consciousness other than our mind that we are entering into the true sense of spirituality. And this is a very important point, because instinctively, because our mind is so conscious and so developed as an awareness, we tend to think that the spiritual experience will be of this type. My mind will become aware of the infinity and the eternity. Yes, it will also share in that, but the consciousness which is infinite and eternal is not mental. And so there is a kind of a reflection in the mind from there, but until we begin to actually live in that, we have not really come into a permanence of it. And that's why reflections from there come, we have brief experiences and we lose them because we are still largely registering a reflection in the mind consciousness. And he says, finally, as this emerges, the spiritual being can actually bring down a still higher power, the supramental power, by which it can reshape the mind, reshape the life, and even eventually reshape the body in its terms, to make them fit instrument and even a spiritual instrument. The current paragraph which we are at takes up the question of how are we to make this separation and why this distinction between the spiritual and the mental is so important. And he goes deep into this, that the clarity we must have, even the formations which emerge in us as a mixed form or urge, we must recognize is not in itself the spiritual life. At best, it is a preparatory turn. So he says, spirituality is not high intellectuality, it is not idealism, not an ethical turn of mind or moral purity and austerity, not religiosity or ardent and exalted emotional fervor, and not even a compound of all these excellent things. And this is where we were last time, that it's not even a mix of these things. And he says these are excellent things in themselves, wonderful to have as a base, but they are not in themselves spiritual. And then he says, a mental belief, creed or faith, an emotional aspiration, a regulation of conduct according to a religious or ethical formula are not spiritual achievement and experience. These things are of considerable value to mind and life. They are of value to the spiritual evolution itself as preparatory movements. But they're not in themselves spiritual. And we went through this in some detail last time, seeing how what normally passes for spirituality and even religious fervor in so many traditions. And in India, so much of spirituality is actually just this ethical, moral, turn of heart, emotional fervor, etc. And people take those symbols or the behavior which comes with those turns as signs of spirituality. And we have to be very clear, this is not it. At best, it is preparatory. And so he will describe now how these things can serve. And then, what is spirituality? So he says they're of considerable value to mind and life. They don't open you to the spirit, but they prepare your mind and life for the spirit. How? Disciplining, purifying, or giving a suitable form to the nature. Now this is a very important part of the journey, that as you work to deepen your consciousness, awaken to the spirit, or make your nature receptive to the spiritual influence, your nature, habit, personality, character can either be accepting and plastic to receive, or it can be resistant and revolting and reacting and opposing. Can we prepare the nature such that this influx of the spiritual influence can be received and a ready base made? And so 3 things he describes: disciplining, purifying, and giving suitable form. So they are in sequence. The first step of disciplining. Why is this important? If the habit of your emotions, for example, is to always say no but. I don't know if you have seen a lot of people in conversation. Anything you say, the first response will be no but. And there's almost a need to neutralize, to counter. And then after a long-winded discussion, they may come back to the same thing, but it has to start with no but. And it's a habit of the thinking or some emotional part, that anything that comes, you stop, step back, and as if shrink in fear. We had a senior person in our school administration many decades ago, and it was known that anybody approaching her with any request, her response would be no. Not possible. And then she will think up a reason why it's not possible. And the joke which was narrated to me by her secretary was, there was an offer students made, we want to gift a machine, a photocopier. She said, no, but. What was the reason? Logic? She said, if you have a machine, it will be used. And if it is used, eventually it will break down. And when it breaks down, who will repair it? The instinct was so fixed on resisting any change. Now, if such an instinct is there, I'm taking a very ordinary example, but if this is true of little suggestions of ideas from outside, how hard will be the reaction to a spiritual influx which wants to actually open out the personality to infinity? Or in which suddenly you realize, I am not thought, I am not emotions, I am not body. And this bundle of habit which says no but will say, violently it will revolt, it will pull back, or it will go into a reaction. Too much, it is too intense. Often it happens, and Mother refers to this, when the nature is too small and receives prematurely a large experience of spirit, that the person becomes unstable, cannot contain, cannot manage. Sri Aurobindo gives the example in one of his letters of somebody who was in the ashram, a mind very undeveloped, and under the pressure of the help given to him, he began to have experiences of things which he could not unify or digest in the littleness of his personality. The problem was it was too small, and it began to destabilize him. He began to lose perspective, and there was some instability in the physical body. The nerves were weak, and he began to have aberrant behavior. Sri Aurobindo said he had to be asked to leave the ashram. Now, it's not that this will happen to everybody, but what it shows is, first, you need a strong body, strong nerves. If you want to have a base on which the most intense spiritual force can manifest, well, your body has to be made strong. If it's not already strong, it can be built up to become stronger by the influence of the spiritual force. But you have to do that. Second, your vital as an energy of desire and impulsiveness and drive is normally a creature of self-reliance. I will do, I want to do. And even when your mind says, no, but that's not the best thing to do, you can't help it. Your drive of personal passion and desire opposes your own intellect. You know you're doing wrong, but you can't help it at that moment. Such people are often easy to play with, control. And in the business field, it's considered to be a great weakness when someone can be, your buttons can be pushed to create a reaction in you. Unless you have developed in your vital strength either a detachment, a part that can stand back and not be carried away, and from there lead the drive of the vital, which is often the hallmark of a successful businessman, or the vital itself must turn to a higher consciousness, even if nothing else, the mind, self-aware intellect that has some ideal, and the vital accepts to obey and follow that. That process of turning the vital and to make it an obedient instrument to your own higher intelligence can often be a lifetime's work if the vitality is very strong. People whose vitality is relatively weak, they don't face this problem and they don't understand what it means to train your vital to become an instrument because they don't experience such a rebellion. But the ones who have a strong vitality are precisely the ones, if they choose to turn to the spirit, they can be excellent instruments, but they have also the struggle of the turning. And you will see this in the training in the military, where the prime characteristic of leadership has to be a strong vital. And so in the military training, there are two elements. First, this disciplining. And one of the elements of the disciplining is literally beating down the vital revolt or a tendency for revolt by obeying. And each time there is a disobedience, there is severe punishment. So a soldier, for example, who steps out of line, even physically, but of course in behavior, the commander of that group will immediately give a punishment. Take your rifle, hold it above your head and do one circle of the whole ground. And when you come back, you can join. And again, if he does, the punishment is more severe. You may think it is inhuman in a way. And the military is very protective of its disciplining measures. You may think it is inhuman. You would never do this in kindergarten to little children. Obviously, it would be inhuman in that context. But in the military, you have entered first as a formed individual with an individually well-developed personality. You have entered it willingly, knowing that the discipline and requirement of the military is of certain type. But, even more important, the consequence of any rebellious tendency can be the death of millions. So what is at stake in war is the life, the survival, not only of yours, but of the entire army, of the entire country, of an entire civilization. And at that point, when so much is at stake, you cannot afford to have the whims and fancies of somebody however wonderful they may be, however intelligent they may be at that moment, to step out of line. And so there are these very famous poems. It's not for us to question why, but to do and die if needed. Because in the larger context, a group of individuals may be required to sacrifice their lives for the group, for the larger country to survive. And it's accepted. It's part of the larger culture. I'm highlighting this because if this is true of collective action, where we have to work as a team, we should be able to hold back our individual impulse when something is so critical. How much more important is it when this vital has to yield to a consciousness which is not only mental but greater than mind? And it cannot at that point say, I'm going to seize this greater power and use it to fulfill my desire. The commonest reason for a fall in the spiritual journey is when a person has a spiritual experience and the power now is in him, he has this higher knowledge or light or even a love, and the vital seizes upon that and tries to use it to justify or exaggerate its own interests. And this is what often happens when people rush to start teaching prematurely. And they become sometimes famous because of what they have as a power or light, but inevitably there is a slip or a fall precisely because they have not yielded the ego or the desire or the vital rebellious tendency to the higher truth and made that its leader. And so the first step of disciplining is really teaching all the parts of your nature to now follow and obey a higher law or principle. And this can be your rational mind, no problem. But as a first step, you will teach everything to obey. And if you think about what this means, it literally means that you will never do anything in your life, never say anything, never act anything which is purely impulsive and not first thought out by the reason and justified by the reason. How difficult is that? And even for those of us whose vitality is not so rebellious, you realize how much of what you say and do is in the little impulse of the moment. Maybe it seems trivial, so it doesn't matter, but it just means that those parts are not organized around some deeper or higher center of your being. So discipline is the first step. And if you see what is normally passing in a secular training in any school of great, let's say, discipline or high standard, the physical discipline they follow, waking up at a fixed time, obeying the hierarchy, doing things, learning to wash dishes, serving your elders in wiping their shoes, or whatever form it may take. In the army, it's even more extreme. All of these are really ways of teaching your little ego to subjugate itself to something higher. And that higher may be your reason or something outside you, the boss of the whole group or the elders in the hierarchy, whatever form it takes. But if you're able to do that, that same discipline can be turned now to the divine and yield to the divine will. In the integral yoga, of course, we do not take such harsh measures, precisely because Mother observes that it often creates an appearance. And it is okay, that is okay in the army, it is okay in normal social life, an appearance where you feign loyalty, you pretend as if you're obeying, and inside you're thinking and feeling, the first chance I get, I'm going to give you a knock. And that's acceptable because the social life is primarily superficial. But in the spiritual life, you cannot pretend, because spirit is your intrinsic truth. And you can pretend to obey it, but that's not going to work because it knows and you know that it knows. So in the spiritual life, the discipline required is of a different kind. Obedience to external authority or order or rules may be helpful as a first step, especially when children are small, You fit into the discipline of waking up early and basically teaching your body not to be whimsical and teach it to follow some higher order and truth of mind. But the whole internal discipline and integration of that discipline has to be a willing choice from within, so that you do not become a hypocrite. And Mother made it clear in the ashram that she put no rules. If anything, rules were there, they were the minimum as required for an ashram, otherwise you would not have an ashram. But otherwise she said, no rules. I want the children to be true to themselves. Even she did not impose basic disciplines such as you must greet properly every morning, you should say good morning, you must do this. It's very easy to pretend to say good morning. It's very easy to pretend to sit and close your eyes and meditate if that was the routine. None of these things are imposed. And she said, I want them to come as they are. So that if they come with an open heart and mind, she said, I could work on them to change with love. But that, of course, makes it a little more difficult because the same space can be used by the child to refuse to submit to anything deeper or higher. And that's okay. And Mother said, that's the price you pay. I mentioned in the army, in fact, what happens after all this crushing structure of discipline and hierarchy, who is then selected to move to higher levels? Those who have an innate capacity. Those who have a vital which is already large, which has now got disciplined. Those who have already an innate leadership in which they can submit to the others, even if the other is weaker, because that's their innate generosity and the true sense of leadership, as we call it, servant leader. They have something of that is, so to say, molded and made stronger, and only such people move to the next level in the hierarchy. The others are dropped. But if you're aiming at transformation of nature, you should be able to accept all types of nature, which makes the problem more complex. Again, in coming back to the context of the ashram, each one has a different requirement for discipline. There are some who need to go through the struggle of doing what is wrong and then realizing it's not worth it in order to move on. And they must be allowed. There are others who will observe this other fellow who's making the mistake and say, I'm not going to make that mistake, and they will learn in a different way. There are others who need to be told with a lot of affection, and when they know that they are accepted in their heart and with love, then they will yield and follow. There are others who need to understand before they will yield and follow, and all the mixed types among these variations. And so for each, a different requirement of path of, and we'll use the word self-discipline. If you have come to the ashram with the intention of the spiritual yoga, well then, it's assumed you are sincere enough to be able to put into practice. But understanding the importance of the discipline here is so critical. You are training your nature to become first less self-centered, second, to obey a higher call within you or above you, and third, to be able to yield to the higher call by being plastic to its demand. And the form it took, and which was the most helpful, of course, the most beautiful in the ashram, everybody did what they did for the mother, for her love, for her appreciation, for her smile. And so it was easy to relate to an immediate physical appearance. After the mother withdrew from the active physical engagement of day-to-day matters, this was not so easy. Now she was someone more distant, sitting in her room. So there's this very interesting story narrated, which I have mentioned before, but it's worth mentioning always, repeating it. I was in Gujarat visiting, I was taken to a little group, small ashram, and the head of the ashram said, oh, you are from Sri Aurobindo ashram, I have been there. And he said, I learned a great lesson from there, and he narrated his story. He said he came to the ashram, and he was taken around by Sundaramji, and he saw all the work, people working, wonderful things. He said, you're doing great work, you're doing wonderful things, your community is very nice, but he said, As far as I know, unless you serve the Guru, in this case for him the Guru was the physical being but representing the divine. Unless you serve the Guru directly, you can't grow in consciousness. And all of you are working so hard, but your Guru is sitting in her room upstairs in the ashram. How are you growing in? How is your sadhana taking place? So Sundaramji, with deep insight, he said, have you ever had the experience of falling in love? And the man says, yes, of course. And Sundaram said, you know what happens when you fall in love? You're only thinking of your beloved. He says, yes, I understand that. I've been through it. Then Sundaram said, all of us here in the ashram, we are in love with the mother. And so as we are eating, as we are working, we are always thinking of her. So all the work I'm doing here in my little space, I'm thinking of her and I'm doing it for her. And I'm eating food, I'm thinking of her, I'm eating for her. And so everything we do is done in that way. And the man, the guru of that community, he said, that was a great lesson I learnt. But the form of it, you can see how you can turn into practice. Whether it is in this particular form that you relate to the mother, or you conceive of the divine presence which is immanent in all objects, as the root, as the essence, as the soul spark in everything and everyone. And while you may not think of the person who is before you, you're not serving that person whom you may not like at all. You can still be conscious of the presence secret within of the divine, and what you do for that presence. If you're preparing food, you do for the divine inhabiting the people who are going to eat the food, even if you don't like the people. If you're doing some work, you're conscious of the divine which is in your hands as a presence and the divine in those things. And in the work you do, you're making an object more beautiful, more harmonious, more complete, more perfect, as a means of glowing out of that divine presence in the form. So whatever you may do in life, one can still pursue with this sense. And then if you put this as the basis of your self-disciplining, why do you do this? Because that's your way of serving the divine, making yourself more aligned to the divine will, or for the joy that you get from that relationship with the divine. And then the whole process of self-disciplining is not that punishing, burdensome, clashing, dominating, crushing, forceful will, but a joyous turn of self-giving and consecration. Mother wanted the whole movement of self-discipline to have this form. And for that she led through these 3 stages. First, when she was physically present and everyone could do it obviously in that form. Then second stage, when she withdrew and was not meeting every day, but she was there and everyone knew it was for her. And then third step, when she withdrew from her physical body, but then it doesn't change anything really if you keep that same relationship. But you get the importance of this first point of discipline. Without the basic discipline, your instrumental nature is too much embedded in its old habits, in its chaotic, fanciful, impulsive, rebellious tendencies, for it to become a conscious instrument for the spirit. So first step, preparatory movement of disciplining. Second step is purifying. Now, of course, purifying can go on parallelly, but it is most effective when the discipline base is already there. And what is purifying? Sri Aurobindo describes it in 2 steps. First, separating each part of your nature from its mixture with other parts, so that it can serve its true role in the divine work. And second, turning each of these parts now to obey the influence of the divine. So let's look at the first part. When, for example, you have to take a decision. Common example, you've gone to a place of eating and you have to choose from your menu. What will you eat? How do you choose? You try to feel in yourself, and then which of the names or images pulls your desire most strongly at that moment. And sometimes I would like to have the ice cream as well as the cake, but I can't have both, it'll be too much. And I'm struggling, which one? The pull and push is happening. And then whichever is the stronger pull, today I'll have the ice cream. You followed an impulse of desire, which is fine. But now you have to make a choice which is rational. And what happens at that point? Your mind's thinking is mixed by your desire impulse. Your reason tells you, but you have diabetes, you should not be taking sugar, but just today, as an exception, I yield. And now the mind is turned around. If I don't eat enough of the other things, or tomorrow I will skip the sugar, I'll make up for it. The power of logic has been subverted by the desire power. And the desire power is using logic to justify itself. And conveniently, the next day you forget the decision made yesterday and you say, well, today I can have a little bit. It's not much. It's a small quantity and so on. And of course, 6 weeks down when you meet your doctor, he says, have you been able to cut back your sugar? Yeah, I'm still trying. I'll start from today. But why? Because you cannot separate the free thought of the intellect from the emotions. The intellect is fused with the emotions which lead. So the first part of purification is separating the mind from the emotions mixture. But there's a more complex mix which comes from the biology and the physical senses. I'm not used to paying attention to observe. So I looked at the situation, but I didn't notice the details consciously. And having not noticed, the thought process is based on a false observation. Oh, I didn't realize that you were already there, and I took a decision based on the fact that I thought you were not here because I didn't notice. And it can get quickly more serious when little things can play a critical role. Why? Because your mind is still embedded in the biology's limitation and the tendency of the surface senses to ignore, to not observe, to not take in the full data, or to not give correct importance. Or in between the physical senses and the thought, there's a layer which throws in associations. And so I looked at the color, I noticed unconsciously the color provoked within me a reaction from a past memory which made me want to shrink back and avoid. I remember when I was in kindergarten, I still remember this incident where my mother had prepared some kind of a fruit salad and I saw the green of the grape in it and I refused to eat it. Because there was the memory of green chili which had been eaten some days or weeks ago, and the reaction of it, refusal. And somehow the memory of it is still vivid. I remember people saying, but it's not chili. But I said no. And I don't think the adults understood why I was saying no. But this tendency of mixing with associations at a very physical level is still present as adults, and it slants. Someone came, I met them for the first time, but I didn't like them. And later, I meet them many times later and I really like them, but I don't know why the first time I didn't like. And it was because the color of the dress they were wearing, or certain words they may have spoken, or a situation which somehow reminded me of something else which clouded my perception. Now, all of these he has described in great detail in the Synthesis of Yoga, the different kinds of mix which take place, the layers, what the correct function of each layer is, and how it should be freed from the mix of the others. Equally, the intellect influences your emotions, prevents their true enjoyment. The life energy's object in life is to enjoy. It has to enjoy through the senses, it has to enjoy through relationships, even the enjoyment of ideas. But the mind gives to it a turn and says, but this is bad, that is good, and tries to warp what would have been a clearer form of enjoyment, and which leads to other problems. So each layer has to be separated, made to function in its proper manner, and then second step is turning each of these now to their higher relation with the spirit, that the spirit can work through each of these in its proper way. So the second part really is of turning of your consciousness. Thought of the intellect, for example, is to reason. The power of reason, the intellect is to be reasoning out anything, but on basis of what? You see, if the intellect can justify any position, it has to have a context to justify. And the context can be my desire, my self-interest. So the intellect turns down to serve the lower senses, or the intellect can turn up to a higher value and ideal and serve that. It can turn to the spirit, and from there, from that reference, make its decisions. And so each thing is as if turned to the spirit. And so purifying, Mother summarizes the whole thing. Purification is, she says, to respond only to the divine will. Very simply, he summarizes both these movements. My life energies have to respond to the divine will, not to my mind, not to my senses. And of course, it includes the two movements. But this is for our understanding that there's a whole process of turning bit by bit each of our parts, making them conscious, organizing, and aligning to either the deeper psychic center within or a higher spiritual ideal or influence. And you can see how this joins with disciplining. But if the discipline base is there, the purification is a continuity of it. If the discipline is not there, then the purification involves a first phase of disciplining before the actual purification takes place. And so the sequence is critical. So preparatory movements of disciplining, purifying, or giving a suitable form to the nature. Now you want your whole nature to be oriented to be receptive to this. If from childhood your nature has been taught to be selfish and self-centered, if it has been taught to be fearful and distrusting, if it has been taught to follow artificial external values for reference, there's a whole different work of realigning for the spiritual life. But if from the beginning you were taught that everybody, they are your family, they are your brothers and sisters, and you should treat them as you would care for yourself. If you're taught that within you, you already know what is the right thing to do, and you must go deep behind your emotions to find out what that is, and follow always that. And even if I make mistakes, my reference has been trained to open to an inner, deeper guidance. If from the beginning I have been made sensitive, and I feel when things are coarse or crude, and automatically reject or avoid those influences. If from the beginning there has been a high ideal, then it is very easy for this nature to orient to and receive the influence of the spirit. So suitable form to the nature, to make it an instrument for the divine. So these things, all the rest, all the stuff we saw, ethical formula, emotional aspiration, creed, faith, religiosity, etc. These are of value to the spiritual evolution itself as a preparatory movements, disciplining, purifying, or giving a suitable form to the nature. But they still belong to the mental evolution. And now you look back at all the struggle of history, going back a few thousand years, where the religions or the cultured centers in each civilization or the idealistic turn of cultures and thought, all of these have served to prepare humanity for this, for a spiritual age. If there had not been a long preparation of disciplining, culturing, refining, you would not be ready in humanity for a spiritual age. So in the divine scheme of things, recognizing that this time is fast approaching, where this spiritual emergence has to take place, there have been a series of incarnations, vibhutis, so to say, entering in humanity, in different cultures and civilizations, trying to bring these things up, prepare humanity for that phase. But each time knowing that what they are bringing will largely be mixed or lost or even perverted by humanity, and yet the effort has to be made because it will help in that one more step to discipline, purify, and give suitable form to your nature. If you could remember how many lives we have all been through in this phase, you will value the work done across all these lives. And if in this life we could remember all that, the first 20, 30 years of our life, we would have dedicated ourselves to recovering all the work done before, instead of resisting at each step the pressure of our elders or our colleagues to help develop these things. But how much work has gone before today a child can be born in a cultured setting with high values and ideals, that he can grow to be sensitive, caring, and affectionate, and aspiring for a higher possibility. And then the spiritual turn can take place easily. Sri Aurobindo gives a few examples. One is, he mentions the emergence of Sikhism in India. It was at a time when Islamic rule had become quite suffocating and so destructive that there was even danger of losing all the work done. And one of the first Sikh guru appeared, and he organized the movement of defense of society at that point. And he went to every home and asked for the eldest son and made that his first base of the tradition. And the whole meaning of the word itself is to be literally the seeker, the follower, the disciplined one on the path who seeks for the divine. But he says in his own story, he says, I was meditating in a previous incarnation as a yogi in the Himalayas next to a Himkund lake, and I was given the assignment to take birth for this work, he says. And subsequently, what the result was, Sri Aurobindo points out, it was the first attempt to lift the spirituality which was already in the people and unite it with the aspect of strength. And you'll see in Sikhism, the symbol of Sikhism is the weapon, the sword, and then the arc around it which represents the spiritual. And he says, Sri Aurobindo says it was the first attempt to unify these two principles, but it had to fail because humanity was not yet ready for this unification. So it acquired the character of another religious movement. But still, it had the aspect of strength, the power, self-sacrifice, and all the things which come with the strength for a higher cause, for the spirit, for the divine. And to this day, you will see a Sikh brought up in a traditional religious mold of Sikhism has all these elements, the devotion and strength and loyalty and discipline of pursuit. Excellent base. Even if they do not take to a higher spiritual practice, the base is strong. And you will find similar patches all over in India, all over Europe, in different cultures across the world. In the French Revolution, a similar formation of society and political organization, preparing for a time, a couple of 100 years later, when there will be a larger movement towards world unification. But the initiation done right there. In England, there is the tradition of the knights and the sense of chivalry, the sense of honor, and the imprint of those stories is so deep that a child who is brought up on those stories traditionally will spontaneously identify with those values. Unfortunately, in the last 20 years, you see all of this gradually being as if removed and completely opposite values being drilled upon young children. But hopefully, the effort of many centuries cannot be washed out so quickly, and we can rely on that. But understanding the value of this, we see how it prepares for the spiritual. And so, he says, they still belong to the mental evolution, but in the part of the mental that prepares for the spiritual here. And then he says, the beginning of a spiritual realization, experience, change is not yet there. Not even the beginning of spiritual realization. And now he defines what it is. What is spirituality? We've seen what belongs to the mind. And even these higher turns of mind, although necessary for the spiritual, are not yet spiritual. What is spirituality then? Spirituality is, in its essence, an awakening to the inner reality of our being, to a spirit, self, soul, which is other than our mind, life, and body. An inner aspiration to know, to feel, to be that, to enter into contact with the greater reality beyond and pervading the universe, which inhabits also our own being, to be in communion with it and union with it, and a turning, a conversion, a transformation of our whole being as a result of the aspiration, the contact, the union, a growth or waking into a new beginning or new being, a new self, a new nature. It's a long sentence. It has broadly four steps in the spiritual life. And the first prepares the second, which prepares the third, which prepares the fourth. Any of these, or obviously the first few have been covered as you move up the four, will be distinctly the spiritual life. But the first is the minimum which begins the spiritual. So we'll look at each of these and see what each of these words suggests. Spirituality is in its essence. And key word here is essence. The forms can be many, but in the essence is this: an awakening to the inner reality of our being. Awakening, the word itself suggests the reality is already there. You're not constructing, you're not creating, but you're discovering what was already there. And the sense of the first awakening is often very spontaneous, unintentional. You suddenly become aware, something wakes up, something changes, something shifts, an experience emerges, and you're surprised, even perhaps overwhelmed sometimes. But it was always there. So it could also be done by conscious seeking, which leads to the awakening. But the awakening is the first step. And of that, to what? Awakening to the inner reality of our being. The sense of what is awakened is actually, it is more truly me than I felt myself to be so far. I thought all this time that I was this, but now I discover there's something more deep, which I am. So inner reality of our own being, and the sense of it is that feels somehow more real, more pure, more true, more me. And then he gives three words: to a spirit, self, soul. And there are three distinct shades of the experience. So in the first case, spirit, there is no sense of individuality. It's more like a formless presence which permeates. So as if you wake up and suddenly I felt this wideness, as if I was somehow everywhere, or I felt very close to everything. It was as if all nature was close within me, or I was connected with the entire forest, or somehow I felt this love in which everybody was included. Somehow there was a breaking out of my little boundary, but that was more real, more truly me. And so the sense of spirit does not have a particular form or limit, or even sometimes a quality. I just felt spaced out, but I don't know how. It was as if I was in a more awake somehow. I don't know how to describe it. And then I came back to my normal sense. So spirit, first term. Second, self. And the sense of self is that I am that. In the experience of spirit, I felt this wideness and all those things, and then it went away. But in the sense of self, I may still feel wide, or I may feel something deep, but I am that and not this person. And the third word he uses is soul. where the sense is much more intimately personal, where I found deep within me there was this part which was like a child, which was aspiring, which was feeling, which was somehow more awake, or which felt only love. But I was an individual. There's not the sense of the wideness or universality which come with self or spirit. So the character of spirit is much more a character of transcendence. I don't know what it was, but it was something which broke all sense of boundaries or limits. The sense of self may have a character of universality, but you are one with it. And the sense of soul is intimacy of your individuality. And from there, everything somehow seemed different. The world was more beautiful, it was more sacred. Your perceptions may change. So, spirituality is in its essence an awakening to the inner reality of our being, to a spirit, self, soul, which is other than our mind, life, and body. So, in all three experiences we have described, it was not my mind, it was not my life, it was not my body. It was something other. And if there has not been this otherness, then the spiritual awakening is still mixed. And it felt as if my mind was like that, or my emotions were like that, then you can say it is mixed, and it is not yet a distinct, decisive breakthrough. But it's preparing for it. But generally what happens in people is there is a decisive experience, and then it is lost, sometimes over a few days. But after it is lost, you're always yearning for it but can't get it. And the reason you can't get it is you're trying to access it through your emotions or your mind, rather than allowing the thing behind to emerge. And so the correct thing to do, instead of making more effort which only mixes in, you remember the experience. And in remembrance of the experience, you let go of your thinking and your emotions and your body. And as if a part of you leans back, drifts into it, and something of the experience again begins to come back. Maybe not as vivid as the first time, but something of it comes. And you habituate yourself to stay in it. And you notice after a while, you're not in your thinking mind, you're not in your emotional or your physical sensory machinery. You're in a different kind of state. And you get used to that. And bit by bit, that will begin to influence these other three. So the critical elements we see here is that there is first awakening to inner reality of our own being. It could have those three aspects. Which one doesn't matter. But the thing which you have awakened to in the inner reality is not your mind, life, and body. And this is your first distinct spiritual, in essence. All the forms of it and variations are possible. Second layer now emerging out of this. And if this first essence of awakening is there, the second layer, an inner aspiration to know, to feel, to be that, to enter into contact with the greater reality. So, as a result of that first contact, you will find now again and again something in you beginning to turn to it. But you'll notice it can take two forms. Your emotions yearning for it, oh, why can't I get it? And the frustration which comes. Or the mind thinking of it, what was that? What will it be? How can I get it again? What can I do? And none of these get it. But something you may notice after a while, something inside you very quietly wants that. Occasionally you sit down, if you're very quiet, the memory of it comes back and something deep inside you yearns, wanting. But it is not emotional. It is not this excited part that says, I want, why am I not getting? And it comes when all this is quiet. And so the distinction he makes is that even the part which is aspiring is not in the mind, emotions, or body. And so to become aware of the true center of your aspiration is a necessary step. And that's where the second layer begins. So an inner aspiration. And what does it want? To know that, to feel that, to be that, to enter into contact with the greater reality beyond. Because now already you're feeling that is more real than this. And so the aspiration now goes and it deepens out the sense of that is a greater reality. And now what does the reality take form of? What does that feel like? The greater reality beyond and pervading the universe, which inhabits also our own being. Now you might have had any of these three experiences, whether your own soul, self, or a glimpse of soul, self, or spirit, doesn't matter. But the sense of it is that it belongs to something which is of a greater reality. And that reality pervades the universe, but also exists within you and is you also. But the steps it takes to know, to feel, to be that, and generally to enter into contact with this greater reality. So the second layer of the spirituality is the aspiration now, which is within, not in the mind, emotions, body, which is the inner aspiration to deepen the relation with that greater reality. But the sense of the greater reality can be greater, pervading the universe, and equally within you. Third layer. From this it builds that you want to be in union with it, to be in communion with it and union with it. And a turning, a conversion, a transformation of our whole being as a result of the aspiration. So second layer was aspiration. First layer was awakening. Second layer was aspiration. Third layer now is to want to be in communion with it and union with it. So communion is first setting up a relationship where something of you always remains aware of it and now begins to value everything in terms of it. So there's a relationship building, growing, and as a result, bit by bit, there is a joining, merging into union with it. But that's not enough. A part of you inside is in union with it. But it must follow with a turning, a conversion, a transformation of our whole being as a result of the aspiration. So with this increasing communion and union, bit by bit, the rest of your nature now begins to turn towards it. So when the communion begins, it begins from the center of your aspiration. But as that grows, the center of aspiration drags your thoughts, drags your emotions, drags your senses, your body, your actions, your will, your relationships in life. Everything now is affected and increasingly valued in relation to that. So remember, because it is also pervading the universe, which was also within you, there is an objectified form of it also which may grow. It may be felt as something within, or it may be felt as something which fills everything, including filling me. And so I walk into the forest, I tune in once again, and I feel that presence, and I yearn for it, I miss it, and I'm so happy now to be back in it. And then I want as if to lose myself in it, somehow forget all the city life, forget all the things which are bothering me, all my problems. And a turning, all of me begins to turn, a conversion, a transformation of our whole being. So bit by bit now, things now want to value according to that relation. I've seen when meeting with people who have no spiritual inclination at all in a formal way, they will say, I'm not a spiritual person, all those things doesn't interest me. But they're good people in the sense that they live by some standard, some higher value. Go deeper into their life and you will find there is some activity which is for them this state of communion. However fine, however diluted, but it is there. And for many, it takes the form of, I go on a holiday in the mountain, I go into the forest, I sit by the lake, or I go to on a little boat, I go on the water and I'm all alone in the sea or the lake, or I go river rafting, and I'm in this state of extreme excitement and tension when I'm rafting. But in that moment, I have to be so concentrated on the moment of now that everything else is forgotten. And at that moment, I am in a different state. I'm as if connected with the whole river, with the mountains, with everything, and everything is there in that moment of now. And if I slip out of it, I make a mistake, I topple, I lose my balance. Everybody has some point of contact, some point of entry to the spiritual reality, but it stops with that point of contact. But what you will see is its effect on them. Something of the deeper aspiration is there, but it has not taken the form where a turning of the whole nature takes place. It is kept for my holiday occasion. During my week, I'm remembering it. I work hard doing something I don't like for the weekend when I can go and be alone in my forest or on my mountain or whatever it is in my book or immersion. But if this is now combined with the turning of your nature, a turning, conversion, and then as a result, transformation of our whole being as a result of the aspiration. It could stop short with a weak, small, central aspiration somewhere inside, or it can drag the whole nature, and then you have the more active, more deep spiritual life obviously seen, which leads to the fourth layer of the spiritual experience, the contact, the union, a growth or waking, the result of the aspiration, the contact, and the union. These are the three things which lead to the turning of the experience. The fourth stage, a growth or waking into a new beginning, into a new becoming or new being, a new self, a new nature. As a result of this increasing turning through the aspiration or the contact or the union, however much it may be. So there are 3 degrees of the relationship. You have an aspiration, it stops there. You have a contact, it is more vivid. You have a union, you are immersed with this. But as a result of this, a growth or waking into a new becoming or new being. We must make a distinction between the two. They represent again facets of the experience, but essentially you change. You have now become a different person. Or even the whole consciousness has changed so much, you can even say, I have woken up now into my new consciousness, new reality, new status, against which the old status of being was like I was half asleep. And I look back and I say, all these years, I thought I was doing something useful. It was just a half-sleep state. Now I have woken up to something more deep. But I'm become in something, grown into and new becoming or new being. So there are 2 facets to it. In the new being, the experiences of the inner consciousness, which is now totally different. In the becoming, the experiences, my whole nature also is totally different. The way I relate to people, the way I understand things, the way my life values have changed. If I compare it to what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I don't recognize the person, and others also may not recognize. So in the sequence Sri Aurobindo gives, he puts new becoming first. Because the change outside is often what is most obviously seen, and often it may be unintentional. Because from the repeated turn to this, from the aspiration, contact or union, I suddenly find things I used to do which were so interesting earlier now have become quite pointless. And other things have become so much more interesting, which I would have never thought worthwhile to me before. The kinds of things I read, the kinds of things I watch on TV or cinema, or the kinds of friends circle I used to have. My old circle now seems silly, and now I've developed a very different kind. The things I want to go to in terms of programs, I never thought I would go for classical music, which earlier was so boring. I needed excitement. Now I find that excitement to be so superficial, and here I find something deeply touching. And so the complete shift has taken place in your nature. More deep is when you realize the sense of I inhabiting the nature has changed. So a new becoming first, or new being, and out of that, third and fourth steps of the change, a new self. I don't recognize this anymore. A new nature manifesting now, this new self. 4 steps: outer change, inner change, then the inner change becoming a new consciousness, and that new consciousness now shaping my nature, a new nature altogether. So you've seen overall 4 unfolding passages or stages of the spiritual life. And again, he's describing in a most essential way because it includes all the variations. First was awakening to the inner reality, which is other than mind, life, body. Second was the aspiration now of that inner reality, in that inner reality, which is awakened, which wants to grow, to feel, to be that, enter in contact with the greater reality. And obviously now you feel it within you, or you perceive it also around you. Third, where you want to be in communion with it, union with it, and there's as a result a turning, conversion, transformation of your whole being. And the fourth stage, where there's a growth, waking up into a new becoming, new being, self, nature. You will see broadly the phases of the yoga cover all these 4, but all 4 can happen at a very preliminary stage. It's just as the yoga proceeds, more and more it develops in deepening of those other dimensions. The last stage of the yoga may involve a complete transformation of your whole nature and of your entire consciousness. But you can have something of that at a very preliminary early stage also of the yoga, where you go through many layers of transformation of your nature. In all this you will see there is nothing of the elements described earlier of high intellectuality, ethical turn, moral purity, religiosity, emotional fervor, creed, faith, regulation of conduct. None of those are here. But all of those could help prepare, or from here, from the spiritual, they would prepare your instrument to be useful, effective, for the spiritual influence to seep into your outer nature and change it. But you have a clear separation between what is mental life, even in its higher turn, and what is the spiritual life. And all of the spiritual life involves something other than mind, life, body, which is still you, entering in deeper relation, which is with a deeper reality, which is also other than mind, life, body. Where are we in relation to this? And I can say, all of us who are now studying this right now, listening to this, we have some part of us which is already in the spiritual life. Otherwise, we would not find this interesting. There are people who have great intellectual power to read the whole book and say, I have understood. And then move on. Oh, it was there as my homework, I have studied, finished, move on. It has not touched them, it has not changed them. And such people do not have yet the beginning of the spiritual life. But if there has been even a little bit of that beginning, you read the same thing and suddenly it awakens within you. It resonates and it feels almost like soul nourishment. And sometimes even you can say, I read it, I didn't quite understand, but I felt good. I felt deeply satisfied. And that's fine. I shared an interesting incident narrated from our friends in Orissa. They used to have for many years, they still have, regular gatherings once a year where they would read from Sri Aurobindo's writings, from the Life Divine, from the Synthesis of Yoga, Letters on Yoga, and have somebody explain or summarize or read from Savitri, all kinds of activities over 3 days. And often the people who came would come from the most outlying regions of Orissa who did not understand English, or for whom some of these technical terms, supramental, psychic, and all that, made no sense. And there were some like that, particularly, not all were like that, there were some like that, to whom the organizer went and asked, why are you here? You're coming all the way from a most distant place, living in quite uncomfortable circumstances, sharing your room with 100 people or 1,000 people, and you're sitting here listening. Do you even understand all that is spoken? And this old lady says, you know what, I don't understand too much. But being here, I feel like a golden light which is settling here. And the words which are spoken, I feel them scintillating inside me. And that's all. She used her own words, but just that sense of the connection felt during that activity. And the person's openness to feel that. The person had a vivid spiritual life. How much of that are they consciously pursuing? Maybe it doesn't matter. But the fact that they seek and they immerse themselves in that communion, the spiritual life leads to wherever it has to go. You may have no prior understanding, you may have read nothing, you have no idea of where it's going. But just the fact that you have the contact, that you seek it and that you immerse in it, it will lead you. And the journey will take care of itself. Because the Spirit leads. The Spirit is the Guru. The Divine is the Guru. I give another example of a lady who was later living in the ashram, but in her early years, when she came in contact with Sri Aurobindo, she was in Bengal, and she was a housewife looking after her baby. And she narrated this story to me herself in her later years when she was serving the mother and after. So she said, at that time I used to write to Sri Aurobindo, and a letter would take weeks, months sometimes, and Sri Aurobindo's reply would come. She would read and go into meditation. And sometimes her baby was in the swing and there was a rope in her hand to keep the swing going. She would be swinging and remembering Sri Aurobindo, and her eyes would close and she would drift into meditation. And beautiful experiences she had. And sometimes she wouldn't understand what the experience was. She would write to Sri Aurobindo asking, what is this? I felt this, saw this. And among the many experiences, she had the experience of seeing within herself all the chakras and the awakening of the inner consciousness and all the things which normally would be considered to be great experiences, of which she knew nothing. Not having read, not having studied, not having any formal education also. And she was having the experiences. And in one of the experiences, she described how one day Sri Aurobindo came. She was swinging the child, and Sri Aurobindo takes her out of her body, brings her to a building which is all white, takes her inside, and she is brought before a beautiful woman. And Sri Aurobindo says, hereafter, she will take care of your sadhana. And many years later, when the lady came to the ashram, she happened to visit the building of the archives. And she said, this room is familiar. This is the room where Sri Aurobindo brought me. And as she discovered, that's where the mother used to live in those years. The vividness of the experience, the vividness of the help and the guidance given did not require any prior study or intellectual understanding of the nature of the yoga. And everything followed as a result of this turning of the aspiration, inner aspiration to know, to feel, to be that, to enter into contact with the greater reality. And later the mother took her as her personal assistant in working upstairs to clean the space where the mother was staying. And when I met with her and she narrated these stories, it was in the early 90s. And of course, at that time, the mother had left her body more than 20 years ago. And then she shared with me an incident, an observation. She said, she's still here. and I still feel her. And the mother has taken a station very close to the physical, so it is in the subtle physical. And she says sometimes we just feel she's wandering, walking by. And she had, in the way she spoke, it was something so natural, as if she lived in that inner reality while she did her work. And one could see the result of all that she had been through. And to this day, when she was speaking with me, she had not gone through any formal education. I do not know how much she had read even of all of these writings of Sri Aurobindo. But living in that relationship, all these things were unfolding naturally. So spirituality does not require that high intellectuality, does not require that fervor of emotional exaltation. None of those are required. In fact, those things often can act as a barrier. But if those parts are developed and aligned to the inner, they can become excellent instruments to articulate with clarity or to pour out through the heart and the heart's emotions something of the spiritual love and the divine consciousness. So this is where we are. Sri Aurobindo has described clearly distinguishing between the mind and even the higher parts of mind from the spiritual experience. And then he moves to the next logical consequence of this, and we'll just briefly read from that, the next paragraph. In fact, the creative conscious force in our earth existence has to lead forward in an almost simultaneous process, but with a considerable priority and greater stress of the inferior element, a double evolution. There is an evolution of our outward nature, the nature of the mental being in the life and body, and there is within it pressing forward for self-revelation, because with the emergence of mind, that revelation is becoming possible, a preparation at least, even the beginning of an evolution of our inner being, our occult, subliminal and spiritual nature. So this is what we will see next time. The double form of the evolution. And now we understand why the mental evolution and its higher possibilities are so important, including what we saw, the disciplining, purifying and giving suitable form to our nature. That's part of the outer evolution of our nature, outward nature. And then there is the inner being, inner consciousness, where outer nature has evolved mind, and which makes possible now the full emergence of the spiritual. And so from within there is a pressure to come out. And what are the things which are trying to come out and evolving as a result? Inner being, occult, subliminal and spiritual nature. So all of this we will see next time. But you see the importance of the double movement. And now with the emergence of the spiritual, the joining of the two. So far the spiritual had to follow a parallel movement supporting. But now rising above mind, that's the part which has to come forward and come as the part above mind. What was inside has now to come forward. Is the machinery of the outside nature ready enough? Just as there had to be a biological basis of subtilization of the brain and nervous system for the mind to be able to emerge, there has to be the preparation of the mind and our general outer consciousness to purify and make sensitive with an aspiration for this inner spiritual now to be able to emerge. The biology is capable, but it helps if the biology also takes a more subtle form. So if the body, physical body, can not only be trained but made more conscious, made more sensitive, and even within it a kind of an aspiration awakened, then you have the best circumstances for the emergence of this all the way into the most physical parts. And we will recall, we've mentioned this earlier, the program that the mother created for the ashram students precisely was to create in the body this kind of a conscious awareness to make it ready for when the time came for the spiritual emergence, there would be a fit instrument. For us though, it brings forward the importance of consciously assisting the external evolution also. Giving enough time for the physical body to be made conscious and to be made supple and sensitive. Giving time to develop your vitality, to make it strong and large and a willing instrument. Giving time to develop the powers of your mind and your intellect. And the mind itself now beginning to see things and think from a larger and more inclusive perspective. And all of this will create a strong foundation for the emerging spiritual aspiration and influence of spirit to settle in these and shape them in the way necessary most easily. So we'll pause here, and this is a broad framework before us of work to be done. What we also recognize is when the inner consciousness participates in this outer preparation, the outer preparation's result can be much more rapid. But it must still be done. It does not give you the option of ignoring these things. So unlike an ascetic spirituality, which wants the body to be made quiet and passive, which wants the emotions to be dulled and made insensitive, which wants the mind to step aside and stop asking questions and stop being agitated or in activity, so that spirit can be found and for you to withdraw into spirit. Unlike those practices, we need actively to engage all these parts. And what better environment than life itself, where we can put in practice and test the development and improvement of all these things. It is in this context that we can understand the importance today in humanity for what they call self-development and human potential movement. None of these, self-development or human potential, are in themselves spirituality. But both are a great help when the spiritual consciousness emerges to have a well-developed and conscious outer instrument. And so, even though you will see in the human potential movement or the self-development movement, people are trying to amplify and greaten their capacities of intellect or emotions or body. And it's very egocentric. It's very even military oriented sometimes, for military objectives, to make a super soldier or just to make you more successful in your business or your career, whatever object it is. The effort to do that is creating a base on which, if and when the spiritual comes, it will have a greater base. So we'll pause here and continue next Sunday.